You've led a sheltered life. It's not funny, Severance. He sighed. I know. But it's not the end of the universe either. Perhaps not, but it worries me. Listen, Cidra, you want to worry? Worry about what would have happened if you hadn't had all that fancy moonlight and mirrors training. Now that's something to fret about. You don't understand, she snapped. I should be begging for a shot of Oblivo. I should be flat out on the floor, half catatonic. And instead you're just sitting there shaking like a leaf? Don't laugh at me, Teague Severance. She was near tears now, and the knowledge infuriated her. Quickly she used her years of training to regain her self-control. I want to be one of them. All my life I have been trained in the ways of the serene path. Surely I have some harmonic sensitivity in me. I was born to harmonics. Yet tonight I used the ways of a beautiful dance to hurt someone else. Who was trying to hurt you? It's called self-defense, Cidra, and I know enough about harmonics to know that they're not philosophically opposed to self-defense. They're just lousy at being able to act on that belief. Be damned grateful that your only problem right now is that you've got the jitters instead of a full-scale anxiety attack. I've seen what happens to a harmonic who runs into real violence, and it's not very pleasant. She eyed him curiously. When did you see a harmonic deal with genuine violence? Severance ran a hand through his thick black hair, his face drawn, gray eyes suddenly bleak. My brother was one of those random occurrences you mentioned earlier. A harmonic born among wolves. Why wasn't he sent to Clementia? She asked, frowning. It's a long story, and I'm not in the mood to tell it right now. Take a nap, Cidra. I don't think I can sleep yet. Suit yourself. I'm going to sack out for a few minutes. It's been a long night. Severance got to his feet and brushed past her, heading for the sleeping area at the rear of the cabin. He unlatched the upper sleeping berth so that she could climb into it if she changed her mind, and then he threw himself down onto the lower bunk. He was already half asleep when he felt Fred undulating up onto the bed to drape himself over his master's feet. Severance awoke once during the flight and realized that Cidra hadn't tried to nap. He peered through the gloom of the dimly lit cabin and saw her seated cross-legged on the metal deck. Her eyes were closed in silent meditation, probably still worrying about skates and how she'd handled the situation, Severance reasoned in sleepy irritation. She looked very soft and gentle sitting there with her black and silver gown flowing around her. A little lost. But it would have taken a fair measure of strength and coordination to throw skates. She couldn't be all sweetness and light, even if she wanted to believe she was beneath the fine crystal moss fabric of the robe she wore. He could see the rounded upsweep of her BR*********. It seemed to him that the womanly curves would fit his hands perfectly. Then he recalled what she'd said about wolves being very interested in sex. Severance turned over to face the wall and ordered himself to go back to sleep. Chapter 3. Cidra felt the shift in altitude and speed as Severance pay automatically began its approach. The subtle changes jerked her out of the meditative trance she had been using to calm her mind and body. Opening her eyes, she saw new console lights wink on, while others changed color. For the first time she noticed there was a second computer on board. It didn't appear to be involved with the landing operation either. A glance over her shoulder told her that the ship's master was still sound asleep. She got to her feet, feeling delightfully rested, and went to the nearest viewing port. A few scattered lights in the distance heralded the presence of Lovelorn, a manufacturing town that had been located near the ore-rich deposits of the continent's western mountains. Beyond the mountains lay an ocean that extended most of the way around Lovelady. It was almost totally unexplored, although research indicated it would ultimately prove even richer in raw materials than the continents. There was a lot of Lovelady waiting to be thoroughly explored, and even more of Renaissance and QED. Beyond the three close-in planets lay one other, liquid assets, a frozen ocean of a world that lacked a breathable atmosphere. It hadn't experienced more than a few exploratory landings so far. The Stanza 9 system was still a frontier, its population centers small, even on Lovelady, which was its most heavily populated planet, Cidra felt a glimmer of excitement rush through her. She was on her way, off in search of a legend. For the first time she acknowledged that the search, itself, was going to prove fascinating. The ship altered course again, and this time Cidra turned around a little anxiously to see if Severance had awakened. When she saw him lying spread eagle on his stomach, face to the cabin hull, she decided to act. She went over to the bunk and reached down to touch his shoulder, only to find she had made a terrible mistake. There was no startled shout or sleepy, questioning groan. Severance simply exploded off the bunk at the touch of her hand. He was on the deck, feet spaced apart in a fighter's crouch, before Cidra quite realized what had happened. The small weapon he had used on skates was in his right hand. Somehow he had gotten it out of the utility loop he'd hung beside the bunk. Cidra froze, not daring to breathe as his eyes flickered in recognition. With a muttered oath, Severance dropped the black metal object back into his loop. The poised tension went out of his body. On the bunk, Fred exposed his team briefly, and then went back to posing as a rug. A few more surprises like that, Cidra, and one of us isn't going to make it as far as Renaissance. She cleared her throat. I just wanted to tell you that we're approaching Lovelorn. The ship seems to be altering course. I assumed that, as pilot in command, you might have some interest in the matter. Not much, Severance assured her. This baby can land herself if necessary. Nevertheless, he went forward to check the winking lights on the command console. Saints know she's done it before. He yawned and massaged the back of his neck with one scarred hand as he stood staring down at the controls. Severance? What is that instrument you carry? The one you had in your hand a moment ago? It's a remote for a screamer. He leaned down and depressed a red-lit control, watching the screen in front of him as he did so. Severance banked gently into a turn. I've never heard of a screamer, Cidra said. I don't imagine you've got a lot of use for them in Clementia. They're not exactly legal. But what does it do? It's very good at making uninvited visitors scream. His obvious preoccupation bothered her. That's not much of an explanation, she said reproachfully. Cidra was accustomed to an educational system that answered all questions as completely as possible. She was also trained to keep asking questions until she was satisfied with the answers. Severance shrugged, still watching the landing setup on the screen. It's a device that's designed to jam the frequency of human nerve impulses. That's about the only way I can explain it. I've got the main system installed here in the ship. I carry the remote with me. Skates didn't scream when you used it on him. Severance glanced at her. He was already half out. The remote just finished the job you'd started. Cidra stiffened. She wasn't sure if she had been rebuked. But her curiosity persisted. Does the device function automatically whenever someone comes aboard? It can be set that way. I leave it on when I'm gone and switch it off with the remote when I'm ready to come back aboard. But it can also be triggered manually. See that switch there on the console? Yes. That will trigger it. There's another one back near the head of my bunk. You would turn it on while you, yourself, were on board? What about your own nerves? She asked. Curious little thing, aren't you? I'm sorry, she apologized formally. I don't mean to pry into your private business. He sounded skeptical. Well, the answer is that I can set the remote to protect me from the effects of the main system. Fred's safe because his nerves work on a different frequency than ours. Have a seat, Cidra, we're ready to hit dirt. She realized that his patience had reached its limit, so obediently she strapped herself into the passenger seat and fixed her gaze on the lights of Lovelorn. A few moments later, Severance settled gently down into the landing field, and Severance cracked the hatch. I'll be gone for about an hour. No more than that. We haven't got time for you to wander outside and have a look around. You wouldn't find much of interest, anyway. This is a pretty dull town. You stay here and guard the castle. When I return, I'm going to put this ship into space as fast as possible. If you're not here, you'll get left behind. Clear? He sealed the collar of his gray ship suit as he spoke. Cidra nodded, and then asked impulsively, "Have you ever seen a real castle, Severance?" He glared at her. It was a figure of speech, not an invitation to more questions. "I've heard that the ghosts left behind a structure that might have been a fortress," she ventured thoughtfully. "On Renaissance. Why don't you take a nap, Cidra?" Her eyes widened. "I couldn't do that. You're leaving me in charge." Severance muttered something unintelligible and started through the hatch. That was a figure of speech too. "Forget I said it. Fred is in charge. Stay out of trouble, Cidra, if you want to see Renaissance." With that he vanished into the cool lovelorn night. The hatch hissed shut behind him, sealing and locking itself. Cidra felt movement near her sandaled feet and looked down. Fred was investigating the hem of her black and silver robe. Even as she watched, Cidra saw his 3 rows of teeth appear. She yanked the fabric out of reach just in the nick of time. "Don't you dare chew on my clothes. Just because you're the one who is officially in charge, don't get the idea you can terrorize innocent passengers." Then she smiled at the creature. Fred continued to expose his teeth, and Cidra chose to believe he was smiling back. She reached down to scoop him up into her arms and discovered it was difficult to pick up a rug. There seemed to be no stable bone structure inside Fred. He didn't appear to mind the awkwardness of her grip, however. He simply wrapped himself around her forearm and continued to grin. Cidra looked for something resembling eyes. "You're a lovelady rock rug, aren't you? I've seen holotapes of your kind sunning themselves on mountain rocks. How do you like shipboard life?" There was no answer, but the 3 sets of teeth disappeared into the tatty fur covering. As Fred settled down to sleep on her arm, Cidra thought she saw a couple of small black eyes wink shut. It was hard to be certain because of the scraggly fur. Her arm felt pleasantly warm with the rock rug wrapped around it. She wandered around the tiny cabin, investigating the functional, if Spartan, lavatory facilities and the miniature galley with its preserver and heater. She checked the preserver to see if there were enough non-meat food packs aboard to hold her until Renaissance. It was a limited selection, at best. Teague Severance was definitely carnivorous. Typical wolf. Well, if he were willing to do without some of the vegetable packs, she might not starve to death. For someone who had been brought up to appreciate exquisitely prepared food, the prospect of 2 weeks of preserved vegetables was not a pleasant one. But one had to make sacrifices when one set out on a quest, Cidra reminded herself as she shut the preserver. The heroes in the first family novels always sacrificed comfort when they went adventuring. She ought to know. She was an expert on first family novels. The only real expert in Clementia. She wandered over to the sleeping berths and fished around beneath Severance's bunk for her precious pack of books. Before she found it, she encountered a small metal chest wedged in behind the crate of ale. She was far more intrigued by the unimposing storage container than she should have been, perhaps because she knew immediately that the box would contain something that was very personal to the enigmatic man who was taking her into space. For the first time in her life, Cidra found herself wanting to explore the private side of another human being without waiting for an invitation. It took an amazing amount of fortitude to push the unopened chest back into the sticky storage net. But the ingrained rules of privacy were far too strong in her to allow Cidra to do otherwise. She pulled out the pack of books. Her mind and body had settled down again. She would happily occupy the next hour reading. She deliberated between the elegantly worked volume of Nisco's Serenity and Ritual and the anonymous collection of essays and poetry known as Passages to Appreciation. She knew she ought to choose something from one of them, but somehow she wasn't in the mood. Cidra dug a little deeper into the pack and came up with a hidden bundle of data slips that contained her collection of novels. Novels didn't warrant much more than cursory interest on the part of harmonics specializing in social history. She'd had no competition when she'd chosen to become an expert on them. But Cidra loved novels. She had acquired a sizable collection on slips, and when the time had come to leave Clementia, she had been unable to abandon them. Cidra removed the reader and a slip that contained one of her favorite tales and curled up on the lower berth to read once more the adventurous story of a mythical first family colonist. Without any hesitation at all, she skipped along until she came to the love scenes. The love scenes in such stories held an interest for her that she had never stopped to analyze. But she was more exhausted than she realized. Cidra was in the middle of a torrid seduction when she fell asleep. It was the distinct impression of wrongness that awoke her a few minutes later. For a moment she lay quietly, eyes closed, and tried to analyze the feeling. She immediately realized that Fred was no longer wrapped around her arm. She could feel the warmth of him lying on her stomach, but he didn't seem quite as boneless as he had earlier. There was a tension in him that had communicated itself to her and awakened her. Cidra opened her eyes and looked up into the muzzle of a Gehring immobilizer. A part of her recognized the classic safeguard sidearm, even while her brain sought to adjust to the shock of seeing one pointed at her. A large, gloved hand was wrapped around the grip. "Just keep calm, lady, and nothing's going to happen to you." At the sound of the rough voice, Cidra managed to jerk her eyes from the immobilizer to the swarthy face of the safeguard holding it. When he saw her stricken look, he smiled bleakly and used his free hand to display his certificate of authorization. "I don't understand," Cidra murmured, confusion replacing some of the initial fright. Harmonix never had trouble with the authorities for the simple reason that Harmonix never committed crimes. Both safeguards and Harmonix knew it. She had grown up with that serene knowledge. It was built into her. Then she remembered Skates lying on the floor of her hotel room. "What's wrong?" "He's all right, isn't he?" The man holding the immobilizer appeared amused. "Who?" "Severance? As far as we know. Don't worry about him, he'll be back in about 40 minutes. He ran into a little delay collecting his mail, you see. We arranged it that way." They didn't seem to know about Skates. Feeling simultaneously relieved and guilty, Cidra relaxed slightly. "But what are you doing here?" She realized that a second uniformed man was standing near the command console, and her searching gaze rested briefly on him. "How did you get on board?" "The hatch was sealed." The man standing over her answered. "Didn't you look at my certificate?" "We're port security. We have bypass plates for all registered mail ships. Now sit up very slowly. You from Clementia?" She nodded. Fred scuttled down into her lap as she sat up cross-legged on the bunk. Her hand brushed past the small switch that could activate the screamer, but Cidra hardly noticed. She was watching Fred bare his teeth. He didn't appear to be smiling this time. Good. That should make things nice and simple. "We won't have any trouble with you, will we?" Obediently, Cidra shook her head. "Of course not." "Fine." He glanced at his companion. "We won't even need to put a tangler on her, Des. She's a harmonic. She'll stay out of trouble." "But what do you want?" "If you have business aboard, I would have been happy to open the hatch." "I don't understand what this is all about." Cidra turned an unwavering gaze on the armed man. "Whatever it is you're after, you should consult with the master of the ship. We're not quite as formal here in Lovelorn as you folks are in Clementia. We don't always have time for good manners. What we're after is in the cargo bay, and on this kind of ship it can only be unsealed through the command console." Cidra kept her hands carefully folded in front of her. "Then you should definitely speak to Teague Severance." The safeguard grinned. "He's not likely to be very helpful under the circumstances. We're here to remove some cargo he picked up in Port Valentine. But the shipment from Port Valentine is scheduled to be taken to an outpost on Renaissance." Cidra kept her voice very clear and polite. She betrayed nothing of the uneasiness she felt, realizing that her best defense right now lay in maintaining the impression these men had of her. They couldn't have dealt with many harmonics. In their line of work, they simply weren't likely to encounter people from Clementia. Her appearance and dress had led them to mistake her for a saint, so she would play the part. Don't worry yourself about it, Otana. This isn't harmonic business. This is a matter of port security. The man holding the weapon spoke to the silent figure by the console. Find what we need, Des? It's here. The bypass is working through possible code combinations now. We'll have the bay opened in a minute or so. What about her? She's not going to give us any trouble. The first man holstered the immobilizer and smiled again. He smiled a lot. Cidra thought too much. She didn't like him, and neither, apparently, did Fred. There was a curious humming sound coming from the vicinity of the 3 rows of teeth. Automatically Cidra reached out to stroke the rock rug. We're all set, the man called Des announced with cool satisfaction. The bay's open. Let's get the stuff and get out. I don't want to be hanging around here when Severance returns. I couldn't agree more. The first man started for the rear of the cabin where the inside cargo hatch was located. The valuable shipment lay undefended. It was COD, Severance had said. He would get nothing for it if it wasn't delivered. With a kind of stark clarity, Cidra realized that she had to act. In Severance's absence, she was in charge of his ship. Guard the castle, he had told her. Yet these men were official representatives of lovelorn law. The law was one of the few formalized institutions wolves had. It was to be respected. Harmonix knew it often fell short of the ideal, but that was no excuse for failing to honor it. Still, she felt she had to do something. Wait, Cidra called urgently as the first man was about to step into the cargo bay. I must protest this action. I insist you wait until Teague Severance returns. This is his ship and his cargo. You must discuss this with him. Why don't I just go ahead and put her out? Des unholstered his weapon and calmly pointed it at Cidra. Forget it. She's not going to get in our way. Give me a hand, Des. I knew we should have brought a servocart. This thing's heavy. Please, Cidra said, I'm asking one last time that you wait and take this up with the ship's master. Shut up, lady. You're beginning to annoy me. Why don't you meditate or something? Des started to follow his companion into the cargo bay. Fred suddenly leapt from Cidra's lap, undulating with incredible speed across the cabin floor. Des whirled around, aiming his sidearm at the small creature. No. Cidra stopped debating the philosophical quandary in which she found herself. Her hand swept out, yanking at the screamer trigger embedded in the wall behind her, and then she found out why the shipboard defense system was called a screamer. She was barely aware of the strangled cries of the 2 safeguards. Her own mind was suddenly bursting with the screams of every nerve in her body. She had never experienced anything approaching such pain, and after the first few seconds, it held her totally immobilized. Lights flashed in front of her eyes, her ears seemed to hear every harsh, discordant sound in the universe, and her skin was on fire with a rash that made her want to claw at herself with her own nails. But she couldn't even move her hand far enough to switch off the screamer. Cidra could only sit on the bunk and struggle to maintain some hint of sanity, for a primitive part of her was still alert enough to fear being driven insane by the cacophony. And that was the most terrifying prospect of all. Instinctively she mentally grabbed for and clung to the intense discipline that was a fundamental part of her harmonic training, using it to search for and find a thin sliver of consciousness and sanity to guide her through the pain. A true harmonic would not have been able to apply her training under such fearsome circumstances. It was an ironic indication of Cidra's lack of true talent that she could use the training now in a way for which it had never been intended. But Cidra was not contemplating the right or wrong of it all, she was simply holding on for her life. Severance was worried even before he got out of the runner. He stood for a moment on the curb, the small courier pack locked to his wrist. Then he fished the computer remote out of his utility loop. The tiny notation on the screen informed him calmly that the screamer had been activated. He stared at the object in his hand, unable to believe what he was seeing. He picked up the package of preserved vegetarian meals he'd wasted valuable time purchasing on the way back to the ship and broke into a run. Severance Pay sat in heavy shadow on the landing field, giving no hint that all was pain and chaos aboard. The screamer put out no audible sound. When Severance punched the remote to open the hatch, he found that it hadn't been locked. Had Cidra left the ship after all? The knowledge infuriated him, but he found himself praying that she had. If she was still on board when the screamer had activated, she would be limp, quivering marsh jelly by now. He knew what the screamer could do to the most hardened of wolves. He couldn't bring himself to imagine what it would do to someone who was almost a harmonic in so many ways, damning everything and everyone around him. Severance used the screamer's remote to cancel the defense system. But he knew that if Cidra was inside, the damage had been done. He leapt aboard, his eyes sweeping the ominously still cabin. For an instant he couldn't see his passenger. She wasn't on her bunk and she wasn't lying on the floor. He saw the prone bodies of two men near the open cargo bay before he realized that Cidra was slumped on his bunk. Damn it to a renegade's hell. Cidra. Cidra. He crouched beside the berth, searching for her throat pulse. It beat far too rapidly beneath his fingers. The stiffness in her body alarmed him more than anything else. She should be unconscious by now. Even a minute of the screamer's effects was sufficient to knock most people out. Yet the tension in her body indicated that on some level she was still aware, still trying to fight the nerve-jamming impulses even though they had ceased. He began stroking her, petting her as if she were a wild creature he was trying to soothe and tame. There was no quick remedy for the screamer's damage. It took time to recover. Victims knocked unconscious generally awoke a long time later with a headache that could only be described as violent. Cidra, can you hear me? It's over. Listen to me. It's over. Let go, lady. Let go. Severance caught a brief movement out of the corner of his eye. He glanced toward the cargo bay and saw Fred release the leg on which he had been gnawing. The rock rug flowed toward his master. What the hell happened in here? Severance asked softly, wishing the rock rug could answer. Fred hummed a little in response and undulated up into the bunk to settle on Cidra's stomach. Then he began shifting his pliable body in a rhythm that didn't take him anywhere but seemed to emulate the stroking movements Severance's hands were making. It's all right, Cidra. It's all over. Can you hear me? All over. You're safe now. Very slowly some of the unnatural tension seemed to seep from her body. Beneath his hand Severance could feel the gradual unknowing of the muscles in her arms. Her head began to move restlessly. He kept talking to her, muttering meaningless words of comfort. Even though he knew there was no instant cure for the screamer's results, Severance decided to get Cidra to the nearest med facility. If nothing else, they could tranquilize her into unconsciousness. Her lashes lifted just as he started to get to his feet. Instantly he knelt again beside the bunk. Cidra? She seemed to have trouble focusing on him, but at last she realized who was beside her. Her lips moved, shaping soundless words. She touched her tongue to the dry surfaces and tried again. Is the castle safe? Everything's safe, Cidra. Don't try to talk. Just try to sleep. It's the only way out of this. Try to sleep. I know you left Fred in command, she whispered, but they were going to shoot him. There wasn't anybody left, except me. Relief poured through Severance as he realized that she was starting to breathe normally. It didn't look as though he would need the med facility after all. Gently he continued stroking her. We'll talk about it when you wake up. Go to sleep, Cidra. Close your eyes and go to sleep. He watched her relax slowly into unconsciousness, and then he got to his feet once more. He studied the two men lying near the cargo bay while he unlatched the courier pack he had just picked up from a patron. It was being sent to Renaissance, and Die Shipper had been most anxious that it travel under computer lock. To humor him, Severance had performed the little drama of latching the pack to his wrist. It was an ancient shipping custom that could still impress customers, although Severance privately thought it wasn't very practical as a security technique. But it seemed to have reassured the patron. It had also taken up precious time. Dumping the pack carelessly into a nearby storage bin, Severance went toward the cargo bay to investigate the intrusion that had apparently caused Cidra to pull the screamer. With the toe of his boot, he nudged one of the unconscious, uniformed men onto his back. Then he went down on one knee and pulled out the man's certification card. For a long time, Severance studied the port security identification. It appeared almost genuine. It would easily have fooled Cidra, who wasn't accustomed to double-checking a stranger's ID. The second man was sprawled halfway through the cargo bay opening. His arm still lay across the shipping container bearing the red COD seal. Suddenly it all made sense to Teague Severance, all except one small matter. 20 minutes later, as Severance lifted off for the long trip to Renaissance, Severance was still pondering the fact that Cidra Rainforest must have gone against everything she had ever been taught when she'd used the screamer to stop two safeguards from stealing the shipment. A postman could do worse than go into space with a woman who was willing to risk her life for the mail. Chapter 4. Cidra's first thought when she awoke was that a giant Torla had accidentally stepped on her head. Such a thing could only happen accidentally, as Torlas were too stupid to do anything on purpose except eat. They were also too stupid to move once they had accidentally stepped on someone. So, of course, Cidra assumed the beast was still crushing her, unless, of course, this was the first assault in a war of revenge against the human population of Lovelady. If it was, Cidra could hardly blame them. The big, dumb, placid Torlas had become a prime source of meat shortly after the first families arrived. Knowing Torlas, it might have taken them 200 years to wake up to the fact that they had an enemy. I'm a vegetarian. Cidra didn't even try to open her eyes as she squeaked her protest. The Torla on her head didn't move. I know, came the response from somewhere to her right. Just one more problem. Here, I've got some Jessics. They won't knock you out like that Oblivo stuff does, but they'll help the headache. Open your mouth, Cidra. They have to dissolve under your tongue. A strong, sinewy arm slid under her shoulders, lifting her. The pain in Cidra's head changed from a steady state of heavy pressure into sharp bolts of lightning. Tears burned beneath Cidra's eyes. The humiliation washed over her, momentarily more intense than even the agony in her head. I apologize, she gritted. For what? Severance asked, calmly shoving two small objects under Cidra's tongue. The tears? Forget it. Most people would be screaming about now. Cidra sensed a faint fizzing sensation as the tablets dissolved. Experimentally, she lifted her lashes and found herself looking up into Teague Severance's gray eyes. He didn't appear especially pleased with her as he knelt beside the lower bunk, cradling her in one arm. There was a grimness around the edges of his mouth. The act of screaming would only make it worse, Cidra explained with grave logic. She managed to blink back the incipient tears. It can't be as bad now as it was when you cranked on the screamer. Saints in hell, lady, that thing must have ripped you apart. I thought that's exactly what it was doing. Automatically, she looked down at herself. The black and silver surplice was a mess, stained in places from her damp, perspiring body. The finely spun crystal moss fabric looked as crumpled as she felt. But she seemed to be all in one piece. Then she realized she didn't feel quite right even though nothing appeared to be missing. Are we in space? 2 hours out of Lovelady. I've got the grav on. Severance steadied her with one hand while his other went to her braided coronet. The artificial gravity explained the faint strangeness she was feeling. What are you doing? Belatedly, Cidra realized that Severance was freeing the fire burl comb in her hair. I thought your head might feel a little better if you loosen those braids. He tossed the expensive comb down onto the bunk beside her and deftly began unpinning her hair. The intimate touch of his hands was vaguely alarming. Cidra wasn't accustomed to much physical contact. Harmonics had a great respect for the privacy of another person's body. Instinctively, she tried to draw away from Severance. His grip on her shoulders tightened in response. Hold still. I'll have these down in a minute. I'll do it. She lifted her hand to her hair, trying to take over the small task. Her fingers came in contact with his, tangling for an instant. He ignored her efforts, pushing her hand aside. She felt the roughness of his scars. I've almost got it. This must be harder to put together than a coalition of free miners on QED. How long does it take every morning? 2 long braids tumbled free, falling down over Cidra's *******. As if intrigued by the intricate braiding, Severance's fingers followed the line of one braid all the way down to the tip. His hand hovered there, filling Cidra's body with a new tension. Her concentration was abruptly torn between the pain in her head and her intense awareness of the proximity of Teague's fingers. She realized that she was holding her breath, knowing that if she inhaled, she would thrust herself against his hand. I work my hair during the first morning change. She couldn't think of anything else to do except answer his question. He was beginning to unwind the individual braids now, starting from the bottom and moving upward. Cidra drew a small sigh of relief as the masculine fingers moved to her shoulder. She could risk breathing again. Well, you'll have plenty of time on this trip to fool with your hair. How's the head? Better. Good. With any luck, no one will find those 2 fake guards for a whole day or 2. They won't have any Jessics to help with the headaches. There was a certain distinct satisfaction in Severance's voice. Cidra looked up at him as her hair loosened beneath his touch. Fake guards? They didn't represent port security at Lovelorn? No more than I represent a convention of saints. Good idea, though. I'm not surprised you bought their story. And they must have had some good connections too. It's not that easy to get hold of an official mail ship bypass. Why were they trying to steal your cargo? Those sensors we've got on board are one-of-a-kind gadgets. The latest designs out of XLX Labs. The company wants them shipped to their exploration post on Renaissance. I've never heard of XLX. It's a small outfit run by a tough little guy who left one of the big exploration companies a few seasons ago to start his own firm. His name's Quench. He's shrewd, and he's willing to slit throats when necessary. I've handled a few private shipments for him lately. He seems satisfied. If he can get XLX up and running within the next 3 or 4 seasons, he'll own one of the hottest exploration companies in the system. And you'll be one of his most trusted mailmen. He'll give you the most lucrative runs. Maybe even employ you full-time so you won't have to scrounge for shipments. Severance showed his teeth. Nobody ever said harmonics aren't as fast as everyone else when it comes to figuring out a business deal. Harmonics have to be fast at analyzing business situations, Cidra informed him demurely. If they weren't, they'd get eaten alive by unscrupulous wolves. They seem to do all right. Where do you think the phrase rich as a saint comes from? I don't know of too many poor ones, except perhaps for the young ones who are still doing research or perfecting their art in music. Cidra shrugged and instantly regretted it as the pain flared back to life in her head. Severance was right. The harmonics participated in the freewheeling business practices that dominated commerce throughout the Stanza 9 system. Clementia produced and marketed the results of scientific research, as well as fine art, poetry, and music that thrilled the senses. Wolves were a ready market for the talents of Clementia. But when it came to business, harmonics couldn't rely on the customary goodwill of the general population. Agents who were wolves themselves were used for the often fierce negotiating that took place when a harmonic product went up for sale. Her own father had made a sizable fortune selling sophisticated investment strategies. Constructing and analyzing complex economic models of the wide-ranging commerce of the worlds of Stanza 9 was a hobby for Gamoquist. He was a mathematician by training and inclination. Cidra considered what she had just been told. So someone else wants those sensors? Looks like it. Since they're supposed to be top secret, that presents an interesting problem. Severance finished untwisting one long braid. He drew his fingers down through it slowly. There was an oddly preoccupied expression on his face as he watched the red highlights hidden in Cidra's hair come to life in the thick stuff. Cidra, herself, found it difficult to maintain a casual conversational tone as she asked, if the sensors are so valuable, why weren't they shipped out on a commercial freighter under company guard? Instead of answering right away, Severance began to work on the second braid. This time his hand seemed to be almost resting on her breast as he began unwinding the strands. And when he spoke, Cidra heard a new harshness in his voice. In addition to the fact that it costs 3 times as much to ship that way, Quench wasn't sure it would really buy him any protection. There's no method of keeping that kind of shipment secret. He was hoping that if he sent the sensors with me on a normal private mail hop, no one would notice. It was a risk, but that's how you make good credit. Well, someone did notice. Cidra began to breathe again as Severance's fingers moved upward. A part of her felt strangely disappointed, but another part was appalled at her own sensual curiosity. She had been so sure she had outgrown the very unharmonic desire for physical knowledge that had tormented her socially as a young girl. Do you know who? Who knew the shipment was traveling with me? No. I have no idea. Those men who came into the ship were probably mercenaries. No telling who hired them. What did you do with them? Stuffed them into a storage locker outside the terminal at Lovelorn. He finished his self-appointed task and sat back on his haunches to survey the effect. Cidra's soft red-brown hair flowed in a cape over her shoulders. He stared at it for a moment, and then his eyes shifted to catch her questioning gaze. They're lucky I didn't leave them with something more permanent than a killer of a headache. The coldness in him reached Cidra in a wave, chilling her to the bone. For the first time since she had left Clementia, she allowed herself to remember that murder was not an unheard of crime among wolves. A movement around her ankles broke the spell. Grateful for the small interruption, she turned her head to see Fred undulating into a more comfortable position across her legs. Fred was quite a hero. You should have seen him go after that one guard, Cidra said with a weak smile. Severance's attention stayed on her profile. I saw what he did to the renegade's leg. I wondered earlier if Fred might bite. I guess I know now. He did a little more than bite the bastard. Fred's got 3 layers of teeth. When he starts chewing on something, he makes a real meal out of it. Severance stood up beside the bunk. Think you'll be okay? Hastily Cidra nodded. My head is much better, thank you. Severance leaned forward, his face suddenly very intent. It wasn't Fred who was the hero. He was only acting out of instinct. You were the one who had to go against some fairly strong conditioning to try to stop those 2 renegades. I know harmonics normally don't get mixed up with safeguards. I owe you, lady. Cidra realized that she was feeling inordinately pleased by his words. She smiled for the first time since she had awakened with the awful headache, but offered the formal response to his praise. It was as nothing. No sense of obligation is required. Severance stared at her for an instant and then grinned. That's a harmonic for you, polite to the last drop of blood. He turned from the bunk. Feel like a cup of coffee? Yes, thank you. Cidra lay back carefully on the bunk, aware that she now missed the comfort of his touch. It said a lot about her weakened condition that she would have liked to have him continue to hold her. She watched as he dialed open the compact preserver and removed the container of green crystals. He poured the coffee into 2 mugs and shoved both into the heater. The machine added water and brought the mixture to a quick boil. Severance opened the heater and brought one of the mugs over to Cidra. He held the other one in his fist as he watched her cup her hands around the pleasantly warmed mug. When you're feeling better, we're going to have a talk. She inhaled the fragrant steam. I realize that. You'll probably want to outline my duties for the next 2 weeks. I'm really feeling much better already. We can talk now if you like. Your duties, he repeated, sounding as if he were repressing a groan. He dropped down onto the bunk beside her, staring at the bulkhead. Leaning forward, he rested his elbows on his thighs, the mug of coffee loosely suspended between his knees. Yes, there is the little matter of your duties on board. We'll come to that later. There are other things that have to be resolved first. You've never been in space? My parents took me on a commercial freighter once when I was younger. It was more of a sightseeing trip than anything else. Other than that, I haven't spent any time on a ship. Aha. He paused, apparently trying to find the exact words. You will note that, as I mentioned over dinner, is very little room in here. Don't worry, I don't think I'm claustrophobic. Of course, I haven't spent several days in a confined area before. But I'm sure I'll be able to handle this. Claustrophobia is not what I was worrying about. He took a long sip of the coffee. Let's see if I can put this so that it sounds reasonably diplomatic. Harmonics, as I understand it, are accustomed to a great deal of privacy. Yes. They are also accustomed to a great deal of personal independence. Of course. She waited expectantly, wondering where he was leading. There is very little of either on board ship, Severance concluded bluntly. Small mail ships such as this one are not exactly bastions of democracy. The only way we're going to survive without resorting to violence over the next couple of weeks is if you understand that I'm in charge. I know harmonics are brought up to question everything. But around here, when I give an order, I am not bringing the issue up for debate. Whenever there is a choice about the way something is done, we do it my way. Cidra told herself not to be offended, but she knew her voice sounded overly formal. I assure you I understand the tradition of a captain being in charge of his own ship. He looked at her in mild astonishment. You do? I read a great deal, she confided. I'm a trained archivist. One of my areas of expertise is the fiction written about the first families and the early explorations. Wonderful. His mouth crooked dryly as he took another swallow of the coffee. I'm sure all that reading will have prepared you to slip right into shipboard life. I've had trouble with the few previous passengers I've had on board, but I can see that won't be the case with you. Perhaps the residual pain in her head was making her more sensitive than usual. Whatever the reason, Cidra felt a touch of annoyance. There's no reason to be flippant. If you've had trouble with previous passengers, my guess is it's because you were impolite or abrupt in your manner of giving orders. Orders sometimes have a way of sounding rude and abrupt. I just want it clear that the tone of voice in which they are given does not alter the fact that they're still orders. Understood? I have the feeling I've just received the first command. Message clear and comprehended, Oten Severance. I've told you to skip the Oten. Would you prefer that I address you as Captain Severance? Now who's being flippant, he drawled. Use my name. Either name. I don't think the informality will do much damage to the sense of discipline in the remainder of the crew. He glanced at Fred. Did Fred ever have any sense of discipline to begin with? Cidra asked, not a lot. Severance was quiet for a while. I don't suppose you know how to play free market? Harmonics do not gamble. I was afraid of that. It's going to be a long 2 weeks, isn't it? Cidra hesitated. But she did want to be as accommodating as possible. I could learn to play the game, she offered tentatively. It's not necessary to make wagers, is it? I expect that the game is played the same, with or without credit being exchanged. The stakes are what make the game interesting. Oh. Well, it's a moot point. I don't have anything to put forth as a wager except perhaps a few novels on data slips. I don't imagine that would interest you. She felt relieved. She had made the offer, and it was obvious that Severance wasn't too excited about it. Cidra felt off the hook. I could try teaching you the game first, and then we can decide whether you've got anything worth wagering, Severance said slowly. A faint thread of wariness unfurled inside Cidra. She studied Teague's unreadable face. I've heard that many wolves are quite addicted to gambling. It's just a way of passing time. A form of recreation. Not to be taken too seriously. Then you are not one of the addicts, she asked cautiously. Severance smiled, that same grin that showed so many fine, strong teeth and so little real humor. Of course not. I'm only a casual player. Oh, good. She felt vastly relieved. Well, in that case, I suppose I could attempt to learn to play free market. We'll give it a whirl after we've had some sleep. I keep standard lovelady days on board ship. He got to his feet. Think you can make it up into your own bunk? Or do you want me to carry you? Gingerly, Cidra started to sit up. Fred moved off her feet with a low, grumbling sound. Cidra ignored him, concentrating on her body's reactions to the movement. Her head still hurt, but the pain seemed distant, a dull threat but not a major disaster any longer. She massaged her temple, aware of a vague sense of weary disappointment. What's the matter? Still feel like your head's going to explode? Severance slid a rough hand under her curtain of hair and began kneading the nape of her neck. It's not that. I feel much better. It's just that, she broke off and moved her hand in a gesture of dismay. I shouldn't feel much better? Never mind. It's hard to explain. Severance continued to work on the base of her neck. Still worrying because you don't have a saint's catatonic reaction to pain? It's just one more reminder that I have a long way to go before I become a harmonic. You must understand. I don't want to feel pain. No one does. But every time I do, I'm aware of the fact that I don't react to it in a normal fashion. Normal for a saint. That's what I was born to be, Severance, she said with soft insistence. I remember once when I was very young. I had slipped away from my parents and was trying to climb into one of the plaza fountains in Clementia. They're so beautiful with the light beads mixed into the water. I wanted to go swimming in that beautiful, shining water. That was before I realized that one didn't do that sort of thing, she added hastily, naturally. Very unsaint-like, climbing into a fountain. Yes, well, I slipped and fell, cutting myself. But I was so excited by having gotten into the fountain at last that I didn't pay much attention to the fact that I was bleeding into the water. When my mother found me, she nearly went into shock. Everyone nearby was horrified. Someone came rushing up with a dose of Oblivo, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in a med facility. I found out several years later that small wounds such as the one I had gotten in the fountain are treated rather casually among wolves. And you had automatically reacted casually at the time. Because you're a wolf in Harmonic's clothing. Severance removed his hand from the nape of her neck. Stop worrying about it, Cidra. We both need some sleep. You want a bath? She stood up a little shakily but without kick-starting the headache. That sounds wonderful. With a sigh she examined her rumpled sleeping robe. Have you got a fresher on board? Sure. Give me the dress and I'll run it through a cleaning cycle while you hit the lav. Thank you. She moved toward the tiny lavatory facility, wondering how she was going to find room even to turn around inside, let alone undress. The ship's lav was nothing like the comfortable facility in her parents' home. When the privacy panel hissed shut behind her, she struggled free of the sleeping surplice with some difficulty. Every time she shifted position she came into contact with some object in the miniature room. Severance knocked on the door just as she finally freed herself of the gown. Ready? Here. I appreciate your help. She opened the panel a tiny distance and pushed the black and silver robe into his outstretched hand. How do you move around in here? It's barely big enough for me, let alone someone your size. I leave the panel open, he told her calmly. The robe and his hand disappeared. Never in a million seasons would she leave the panel open, Cidra decided. Turning carefully, she activated the orange controls set in the bulkhead. A wonderfully refreshing hot spray filled the small room. Cidra closed her eyes and gave herself up to the pleasure of it. Tea was a long time before she reluctantly deactivated the spray, dried herself with the warm air jets, and plaited her hair into one long braid that hung over her shoulder. Feeling infinitely better and deliciously sleepy, she cautiously cracked the panel. Severance? Is my robe ready? There was no answer. Pushing the panel open a little farther, Cidra tried again. Teague? Still no response. The cabin lights had been dimmed. In the faint glow of the control console, she could see the black and silver surplice draped over the back of the command seat. There was no sign of Severance. Belatedly, Cidra realized that he was in his bunk. She waited another moment or two, the sight of her robe on the seat tantalizing her. It was obvious that Severance had gone to sleep in the same quick, uncomplicated way he had napped on the flight between Valentine and Lovelorn. The only option she had was to get the robe herself. Taking a deep breath, she slipped out of the lav and stood poised for a few seconds in the shadows. There was no movement from the lower bunk. Cidra padded barefoot across to the command console and quickly put on the surplice. She relaxed as the garment swirled comfortably around her. Running around naked in front of a strange man and an even odder beast was not her idea of proper decorum. Gathering up the hem of the robe, she went to stand at the foot of the bunks. There was a narrow rope ladder hanging from the upper berth. Presumably that was how one climbed into it. Experimentally, Cidra took hold of the flexible side of the ladder and fit her foot into the bottom rung. After that it was easy. She was safely into her berth a few seconds later. The knowledge that she was truly at the beginning of her quest once again swept over her, making her considerably less sleepy than she had been only moments before. She sat cross-legged on the bunk, closed her eyes, and sought the calming influence of the evening meditation ritual. She was halfway through the elaborate sequence of silent logic when Severance spoke from bottom bunk. "Do you always spend that long in the lav?" Cidra opened her eyes with a start. Instantly, visions of herself darting naked across the cabin to retrieve her robe leapt into her mind. "I thought you were asleep," she said weakly. "I dozed off waiting for you to emerge from your bath." Rule number 1 on board Severance Pay is that passengers don't treat the water supply as if it comes from one of those inexhaustible fountains in Clementia. I assumed it was a recirculating, full recovery system. She was embarrassed and offended. No system is 100% full recovery. You lose a little every time you use the lav. "I understand," Cidra said stiffly. "I will be more careful next time." She gave up trying to meditate and crawled under the covers. In the bottom bunk, Severance folded his arms behind his head and stared thoughtfully up at the bunk above. Chewing out a harmonic always made a man feel guilty. He'd felt the same way whenever he'd lost his temper with Jude. Damn it to a renegade's hell, though, Cidra was not a real harmonic. There would undoubtedly be ample opportunity to remind himself of that fact during the next 2 weeks. He allowed himself to dwell for a lingering moment on the sight of her nude body outlined in the dim console lighting as she padded quickly across the room to don her robe, small, sleek, with an unmistakably feminine grace. Her BR****STS were delicately curved, just the way he had imagined they would be earlier when he'd unbound her braids. Nicely rounded BU****Ox too. Lush and tantalizing. She wasn't a beauty, but she was intriguing on too many levels for his peace of mind. And she was not a harmonic, regardless of what she thought or wished to be. For some reason it was becoming important that he make her admit that. Severance realized he wanted Cidra to acknowledge fully that she was a real wolf, just as he was. Tea was a long while before he went to sleep. The smell of hot coffee and a steaming presspock breakfast brought Severance awake 8 hours later. He opened his eyes slowly, letting himself luxuriate in the fragrance. The little fake saint was obviously up and about. He stretched slowly and climbed out of the bunk. Fred had vacated the premises earlier. He was draped over the back of the console seat, watching Cidra slip another presspock into the ship's heater. Severance yawned loudly, and Cidra whirled around, smiling. The smile slipped, and her eyes went momentarily quite wide as she absorbed the fact that he was naked. After a startled instant, she turned hurriedly back to the heater. "Good morning, Severance. Are you hungry? I hope you don't mind me digging out the press packs. I was just thinking, this could be one of my shipboard duties, couldn't it? Getting the meals ready?" The deliberate chattiness of her voice amused him. He stepped into the lav, leaving the panel open. "I've got news for you." Shoving a food presspock into a heater and pulling it back out again doesn't exactly constitute a full-time job. Now, if we had a grill on board and some fresh food, I might be willing to negotiate. Still, she insisted, it is a task, however small. And we have to agree on something useful for me to do. He leaned out of the lav, reaching into a storage bin for the trouser portion of his gray ship suit. Afraid of getting bored? No. But I definitely want to work my passage, Severance. He didn't respond to that, didn't dare respond. With a grim effort, he forced the panel shut behind him. He had spent too much of the night envisioning exactly how she could make herself useful on board, and Severance knew Cidra would be repelled by the graphic pictures he had formed of her. When he stepped out of the lav a short time later wearing only worn, close-fitting trousers, he said simply, "We'll think of something." "You keep saying that, but what will we think of?" She set the steaming press packs on the small serving table and handed him a mug of coffee, so earnest and industrious, he muttered as he sat down. The coffee tasted better than usual for some reason. Maybe it was because he hadn't had to make it himself. "Give me some time, all right? I haven't had an opportunity to really contemplate the situation. Everything's happened a little fast since I met you on Lovelady." She smiled, but he noticed she was having to make an effort to keep from staring at his bare chest. He blinked lazily, set down the mug with a small sigh of resignation, and reached into a bin for a loose, comfortable, wide-sleeved shirt he sometimes wore on board. He shrugged into it but didn't bother to fasten the front seal. Cidra looked relieved. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm not a prude, you understand. I have had courses in human anatomy. But harmonics are generally quite formal in their attire. I'm accustomed to it." "Yeah, I'm getting that impression. I warned you about the lack of privacy on board." "Yes." She concentrated on her food. "You did. Things on Renaissance are even more, informal. I'm prepared for that." Severance studied her for a moment, taking in the determined carriage of her head. She had her hair back up in the strict cornet, and he wondered how long it had taken her to do it. Her surplice was red, embroidered at hem and cuffs and throat with a delicate purple floss. She was a note of color and restrained elegance against the general gray backdrop of the ship. Quite suddenly he was intensely curious about her. "What's going to happen if and when you find your magic artifact, Cidra?" She frowned. "It's not magic. When I find it, I'm sure I will also find a perfectly good scientific explanation for how it works." He held up a hand. "Sorry. No magic, then. Your scientifically explainable artifact. What will you do with it?" "Go back to Clementia, naturally." "Someone waiting there?" She glanced up, green eyes wary and quizzical. "My parents. My teachers. My friends. A lover?" He almost surprised himself with the question, almost but not quite. The hard edge of his words told him more than he wanted to know about his own reasons for pushing in this particular direction. The color that surged into Cidra's cheeks fascinated him. "That's a very personal question, Severance." "I know. I'm rude on occasion." He finished his meal and tossed the empty presspock into the disposal unit. He was disgusted with himself. Cidra smiled tentatively. "I suppose it's just another example of a wolf's natural interest in sex." Severance regarded her laconically as he got to his feet and walked over to the control console. "You're a wolf, lady, whether you like it or not. Don't you have any interest in the subject?" She quickly cleaned up the remains of the breakfast press packs, avoiding his half-accusing stare. "You must understand that for me a relationship with a man will be much different than it would be between two wolves. There is a man back in Clementia, isn't there? A saint." He leaned against the console, irritated by the way she was sidestepping the subject. Cidra turned to face him with quiet reproach. "There is a man," she began very carefully, "but I am not ready for him." "He thinks he's too good for you because he's a harmonic and you're not?" She shook her head. "Mercer would never think such a thing. He is a brilliant, kind, intuitive man. A fine harmonic who has been both teacher and friend to me. He is in charge of the archive where I work. I have never told him that I would like the relationship to become more intimate. I would not burden him with that knowledge until I can come to him as a true harmonic. You've just stood in the shadows, pining from afar, is that it? For how long? Severance didn't even bother to soften the words. 3.5 seasons, Cidra admitted wistfully. We have so much in common intellectually that I just know things will harmonize beautifully between us once I have overcome the barrier of my non-harmonic mind. I think I may get sick. Instantly Cidra swept forward, concern marking her features. You're ill. Why didn't you say something sooner? She took his arm. Lie down while I get the med kit. Here, I'll help you to the bunk. You do take things literally, don't you? Forget the med kit, Cidra. I'll survive. Come here. I want to show you something. He pushed her gently down into the seat in front of the ship's second computer. Ever seen one of these? A Consac 410. I've never seen one programmed for use on board a ship, but I'm familiar with the basic model. We use a Consac 1600 in the archives. She eyed him uncertainly. You're not sick? Not the way you mean. He nodded toward the computer control panel. A Connie is a Connie. If I give you some introduction, you ought to be able to manipulate this one. Probably, she agreed with no false show of pride. The simple fact was that she could. I learned very quickly. What do you want me to do with it? You said you wanted to work your passage. Her eyes lit up. Definitely. There's something you want done on the computer? I'd like some advice from someone who's had a good education. Presumably, since you were raised in Clementia, you've had the best. She smiled. The best. Chapter 5. 15 minutes later, Cidra shook off her intense concentration long enough to smile up at Severance as he hovered over her and the computer. She understood now what he wanted. This is your lucky day, Teague Severance. I told you I'm a trained archivist. I could just as easily have been a microgeologist or a professional poet. And then, while I might have been able to give you some general guidance or advice, I wouldn't have been qualified to really dig in and program a first-class record-keeping system for you. But as it is, she let the sentence drift off as she turned back to the computer. As it is, Severance concluded, this is my lucky day. I should have known. Wonder what I did to deserve having you on board. There you go, being flippant again. I think it's more than flippancy, Severance murmured. I think at times I'm bordering on outright sarcasm. Postmen aren't noted for their social graces. He leaned closer, peering over her shoulder at the screen. You really think you can get up some kind of workable records and business management program for me? I've been designing and applying records management programs since the day I first set foot in the archives. Yeah, but the stuff you file and retrieve at Clementia is different. I'm not trying to figure out a way to handle a bunch of old slips filled with first family diaries or middle second century poems. I need hard data I can call up on a second's notice, and I'll need it cross-indexed 100 different ways. I figure that if my plan is going to work, I'll have to be able to access everything from personnel information on company presidents to meteorological details on QED. I thought the weather only came one way on QED, dry. Severance glared at her. Now who's being flippant? I apologize. He ignored the formal, self-deprecating inclination of her head. Weather on QED can be damned tricky when you're trying to land a Class A mail ship in the mountains. In addition to that kind of stuff, I'm going to need full payroll capabilities. That means I need to be able to zap credit into employee accounts from anywhere in the system. Only the big exploration companies have payroll systems that flexible, Cidra noted. Just how big are you planning on becoming? He lifted one shoulder with seeming negligence, but Cidra saw the glittering determination in his eyes. I want to build a real organization. Right now private mailmen like me operate on a haphazard basis. Each one of us functions independently with no set schedules. The competition can be cutthroat. How cutthroat. Pilots can get killed in this business. Cidra blinked. You mean because of the dangers of landing on Renaissance or QED? No, Cidra, he said with patently false patience. I mean, they can wind up dead because of the stiff competition. Murdered? She felt queasy. I've heard of some criminal activity among the more aggressive pilots, of course, and occasionally one hears of a landing accident or some such incident, but murder? I don't imagine it makes the newscasts in Clementia. Harmonics probably prefer not to pay too close attention to wolf news. It isn't always intellectually stimulating. You've got a point there. She was beginning to feel mildly irked by his attitude. He was right, it did border on sarcasm. Stepped over the border, in fact. For the first time she wondered if Teague Severance didn't number among the more aggressive in his business. She had just decided not to ask any more questions about the criminal behavior of male pilots when a thought came to her. As usual, she sought an answer without even stopping to consider the consequences. Do you think those fake safeguards who came aboard at Lovelorn were from a rival mail ship?